Hey everybody. In this lecture, we're going to talk about how the movies ended up in Southern California. Why did the movies come to Hollywood? I find this topic endlessly fascinating. I always look forward to talking about it. I hope you'll find it interesting also. A lot of the traditional explanations for why the movie industry came to Southern California are either limited or just downright incorrect. Um, One of the traditional explanations you'll hear has to do with that Edison Trust that we talked about before. Remember, we said early on one of the advantages some foreign movie makers had was that some foreign countries didn't have to pay Edison and the Edison Trust for copyright over using Edison technology. And so, since movies were silent, American theaters could import foreign movies sometimes cheaper than American made movies. One of the traditional explanations for why the movie industry ended up in Southern California was Southern California is as far away from New York City, the Northeast, where was the center of Edison's power base. If you look at a map of the United States, Southern California is as far across that as you can get away from the Northeast. And so people came here to avoid paying the Edison Trust, hoping nobody would notice. There's a couple problems with this explanation. One is, yeah, Southern California was a long way away from New York City, but it's not a different planet. And if people are making movies and they're getting shown all around the United States, and Edison and his vast team of lawyers and private investigators found out about this, it wasn't going to work. Did this happen with some very small operations? Yes. Some real fly-by-night movie makers? Yes. Does it explain why the entire industry came to Southern California? No. The other problem, and just bigger, more obvious problem, is the timing doesn't match up. By the middle of the teens, most of Edison's patent rights were running out. And so there was no need to come 3,000 miles away from New York to avoid paying something you no longer had to pay for anyway. So this is an explanation you'll often hear about how movies wound up here, but it's not a very good one. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. Another traditional explanation, and there's some truth to this, and we're going to talk a bit about this, is that Southern California has good weather. Well, weather helps explain why the movie industry left the East Coast, particularly the Northeast. Places like New York City. A lot of movies were made around New York City in the beginning. With Broadway and live theater there were a lot of actors, there were a lot of costumers, there were a lot of set designers, there were a lot of directors. So it makes sense that a lot of movies were made initially in and around New York City. Problem with New York City in terms of filming was that bad weather, just a lot of rain, a lot of snow, a lot of overcast days. And overcast days early on in movie making were difficult because they didn't use as much artificial light in the beginning, so you needed really bright sunny days for film to come out well. Well, that was a problem in New York. However, that explains why not New York, but not necessarily why Southern California. After all, there's lots of places in the United States that have good weather, that have sunny days. Could have gone to Florida. Could have gone to Texas. Could have gone to Arizona. Southern California has a lot of sunny days. Yes, that's good for filming, but it's not the only place in the United States. And so a lot of these traditional explanations are limited. And Larry May sees something broader, more significant, why the movie industry came here. And again, part of it taps into some of that desire for the movie industry to move into a post-Victorian America and the way movies helped usher in America into a post-Victorian world. Before we can talk about this move to Southern California, however, we need to talk a little bit about the consolidation of the movie industry. Early on, when movies were very short and you didn't need much equipment in the beginning, little more than one single camera to film, movies were relatively inexpensive and easy to make. Get a camera, get some people together, find a place to film, and you could make a movie, a 1-minute movie, a 2-minute movie. But as time went on, and we talked about the creation of the photoplay, and movies were running longer, movies became increasingly more expensive to make. And this started to drown out some of the small little movie makers who just couldn't compete with the larger, more successful movie firms that were coming about. And so as some movie firms became more successful and others started to go away, there was a consolidation in the industry. A lot of consolidation leading up to the 1920s, particularly in the teens. And this consolidation happened in some different ways. There was what was known as horizontal integration. If you study business, they talk about horizontal integration, and that is when one company buys up competitors that do the same thing. So I have a widget factory and I make and sell widgets, and I have a rival widget maker and they make and sell widgets. I'm more successful, they're less successful. I want to grow and expand. I would like to buy their factory and their client list. So I approach the other widget maker and I say, hey, how much would it cost for me to buy you out? I buy that competitor. I've grown. I've become a bigger firm because I bought one of my competitors. That is called horizontal integration. What happened with some of these larger movie studios is they started buying smaller competitors, buying up their talent, buying up some of their films, buying up their equipment, in some cases buying up the land that they had to drive them out and to expand and grow. So there was a lot of that horizontal integration, one movie company buying a smaller movie company. A lot of that going on. But then there was vertical integration, and this was what helped some studios become much larger than other ones. Vertical integration is when a business starts to control all aspects of the manufacturing process, from raw material to putting it in the hands of consumers. So what the really big movie companies started to do was control all aspects. So think of actors as raw material. You need them as raw material to make movies. Well, some of the bigger firms started to sign long-term contracts with stars. In the last lecture, we talked about the rise of the movie star and the increasing importance of movie stars. Well, the bigger firms could lock up stars and keep them under contract to make movies. Okay. Studios started to buy up land and build lots and build sets and permanent stages to lower the cost of making movies. Initially in movies, if you wanted to make a movie and you needed some kind of set, let's say you needed to film at a bank, well, you needed to physically go to a bank or a place that looked like a bank to make that filming. Well, that could be very expensive. And so what some of the more successful studios started to do is they started to build lots where they would have generic buildings, and you would have a sort of generic bank where you could film in different ways to make it look different, but you didn't have to pay somebody else. You owned the land, you owned this building, and so you could easily make movies in these various kinds of sets like that. And this integration went all the way to starting to run and operate movie theaters themselves. So, for example, in Fullerton, I'm trying to think what the exact street is. I don't know if it's Harbor and Commonwealth. think that might be it. The old Fox movie theater. And you see these Foxes all over the place. In Westwood, there's the Bruin Fox. In Pomona, there's the Pomona Fox. All around the United States, the movie studio Fox, 20th Century Fox, would create its own theater chain. And they would only show movies from the Fox studio. They own. Eventually, this would be declared illegal because of antitrust violations. This was a sort of monopolistic practice that would be broken up. But initially, this is one of the ways the studios helped integrate and control their market. So everything from the making of the movies to the seats where people sat and watched the movies, the larger studios controlled. And so smaller little independent firms simply could not compete because increasingly movie theaters were owned by the studios or were in some sort of formal agreement with studios that they would only show movies from certain studios. And so by the time we get to the middle 1920s, there are the big 8 movie studios. RKO, Columbia, United Artists that I talked about in the last lecture would be one of these studios, 20th Century Fox, Paramount, the big 8. And they would make up roughly 90% of the movies in the United States. There were some small independents that stuck around and tried to survive, but the vast majority of movies by the mid-20s were coming from these really large studios. It's these big studios that are going to consolidate in Southern California. And because there wasn't that many of the studios, they could all sort of congregate in Southern California, and it helps understand why they ended up here. All right. So let's talk about some of the reasons why the movie industry was attracted to Southern California. Some of these touch upon those traditional explanations. So, weather, good weather. That is true. That was part of it. It doesn't explain everything, like I told you before. There's good weather in Phoenix. There's good weather in Dallas. There's good weather in Miami. So, it doesn't explain totally why Southern California, but that was certainly part of the equation. Early filmmaking really required good sunlight, okay? Not just lack of rain, but sunshine. To this day, I'm struck, if you see filming that goes on, one of the things you'll notice, even often on bright sunny days on the in the outside, there's often artificial light being used to light up the scene. You need a lot of light for filming. Back in the day, they weren't using artificial light in the very beginning, and so you needed the sun. So that is part of the equation. Southern California, for sure, has good weather. Another thing about Southern California, and if you've grown up in Southern California, I grew up in Southern California, you don't really appreciate this until maybe you start going to some other places in the United States. And that's the varied geography of Southern California. We have mountains in Southern California. If you need snow, you can go up to the mountains. In the wintertime, they're going to be full of snow. We have oceans. Well, we have the ocean, the Pacific Ocean. We have deserts, all within close proximity to us. You need snow, point your car north and drive, and you're going to run into a mountain and there'll be snow up there. You need deserts, point your car east, and you will wind up in the desert. You need ocean, point your car west. Some places in Southern California also south, and you will eventually get to the ocean. Right? If you grew up in Southern California, you just kind of take this for granted, but you go to some place like Iowa, it's a little different. You're not going to find deserts. You're not going to find mountains. You're not going to find oceans out there. The very geography of Southern California was very convenient for movie makers. You're doing a pirate movie, you need the ocean? Okay, there's the ocean. You're doing a cowboy movie, you need the desert? Okay, there's the desert. Okay. You're doing some movie set in the snow? Okay, you can go up into the mountains in wintertime and make your movie. Here is a little map from Paramount Pictures, which was a kind of cheat map for location scouts about various kinds of places. Saudi Arabia, you could go all the way, or the Sudan Desert out to Nevada. Down near Mexico could serve as Spain, Kentucky mountains over here, Africa along, there were certain scouting places that they knew, we can go to this place and we can try to make it seem like some other part of the world. This is one of the advantages Southern California had over other places in the United States, that yes, they had good weather, but they didn't necessarily have the kind of varied geography that we have in Southern California. So that's another helpful explanation. Another thing Southern California had 100 years ago was cheap land. Southern California 100 years ago is not the Southern California of today. It was a much lower density place, much smaller population, and land was inexpensive. So imagine a New York-based movie company in 1908 that's looking at the idea of, we want to buy some land so we can build a large lot with lots of different sets and big warehouses where we can film interior scenes. We need lots of land for this. Where can we go? Well, Southern California was a good place. You sure as hell didn't want to stay anywhere remotely near New York City, because New York City had a massive population in the multiple millions. Los Angeles in 1908 had less than 150,000 people in it. So far fewer people, but a lot of available land. So inexpensive land. So one of the things that attracted movie makers from the East Coast to come to Southern California was when they were thinking about that vertical integration, and we want to build large sets and large studios to lower our production costs. We could go out to LA and buy lots of land real cheap. So if you drive to Hollywood and you drive down Melrose, you'll see the Paramount studio lot. There's the gates for Paramount Pictures on Melrose. If you go down Pico on the west side, you will come across today now what are the Sony studios, but where it was started old time Hollywood back in the day. If you go over the hill into the valley, into Burbank, all kinds of old studio lots, Warner Brothers in particular, over there. And so available cheap land was part of the equation that attracted East Coast movie firms to come out and create giant studios on the West Coast. Another thing that LA had going for it was a lack of union tradition. What do I mean by that? Well, big East Coast cities with much higher populations and more urbanization and industrialization had traditions of unionized workers. Southern California didn't have much in the way at all in the beginning of the 20th century of heavy industry. Just didn't have much manufacturing, or at least large-scale manufacturing in Southern California. And because of that, there wasn't a strong tradition of unions here. Movie studios require a lot of people to do work on theirs. Not only actors, but people helping make movies behind the scenes. Everything from extras to construction workers building sets to people operating the equipment like camera people. Movies require a lot of people. They didn't initially, but by the time we're getting to the late teens and 20s, think of D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, a 3-hour epic movie. It involved a lot of people to make that movie. Well, movie studios, being businesses, want to pay their workers as little as possible. Unions try to collectively bargain and threaten strikes to increase the pay of their union members, and also gather other benefits and things like safe working conditions and things like that. Businesses tend not to like having their workers unionize because it often means their workers are going to fight to make more money. Back on the East Coast, movie makers in places like New York City were already running into issues of movie workers trying to unionize and unions trying to unionize movie workers. But LA didn't have a strong union tradition. Also, the largest newspaper in Los Angeles, the LA Times, still the largest newspaper here, was strongly anti-union at the time. The newspaper was strongly anti-union. And so the movie industry sort of liked that, to have an ally, the biggest newspaper in the town that was going to denounce and demonize unions was something that they had going for it. Okay. One last thing, I don't have it listed here, worth mentioning, however, was that there was going to be a receptive political environment for the movie industry to come to Southern California. New York City had lots of important industries at the turn of the 20th century. It was a city of over 2 million or over 1 million people. Lots of businesses. Lots of big businesses. Movies were just going to be one other important kind of business in the city. But if the movie industry came to Southern California, it would rapidly become the biggest business in town. And it did become the biggest business in town. And it remained the biggest business in town for roughly the next 100 years. There was a short period of time where the aerospace industry would overtake movies as the largest business in Southern California. But movies would be the thing. And again, the heads of these big movie studios and the idea of coming to Southern California, they really liked the idea. If we go to LA, we will be a big deal. Think of New York as a very big pond, and the movie industry in New York being a small fish in that very big pond. But if the movies came to Los Angeles, LA was a small pond, and the movie industry would be a very big fish and dominate that little pond. That's what the movie industry wanted to do. They wanted a place that they could own, that they could dominate, with cheap land, good weather, a supportive political environment, and a lack of union tradition, so their workers wouldn't be organized and demand more money. Eventually, particularly by the time we get to the 30s, there would be more unionizing activity and unions would come in. But they delayed it for a while. It happened a lot slower in LA than it would have happened back in New York. Now let's start talking about something that's really interesting with it. There was something else about Southern California that was attractive to the movie industry. And that was, compared to so many other places in the United States, particularly the Northeast, New York City, Philadelphia, Boston, even big Midwestern cities like Chicago and Detroit, Cincinnati, Los Angeles seemed exotic. It seemed foreign. It seemed like a fantasy land, like a place too good to be true. And this image of Southern California existed even before the movies came. This was a place that was sunny all the time. Okay, maybe not literally all the time, but if you're from New York or Boston or Philadelphia, where you have rainy springs and freezing winters and cold falls, Yeah, Southern California is sunny all the time. It does feel like that. That very geography that I talked about was so unusual, so different, you know. You could be up in the snow in the morning and swimming in the ocean later in the day. It seemed different. It seemed foreign. Its Spanish heritage was very different than the East Coast, the Upper East Coast. Florida has a Spanish tradition. Throughout Louisiana, there's a Spanish tradition, but the Upper East Coast and the Midwest didn't have this Spanish tradition. Just think of so many of the names in California in general, but Southern California, Los Angeles, San Diego, right? Santa Monica, Ojai. Southern California sounded foreign. It sounded exotic. Its heritage seemed unique and different and romantic. Okay. And so even before the movie industry came, Southern California seemed like a playland, like a fantasy land. And remember what movies was the business of. Movies are the business of fantasy. Their job is to take the fake and to make it feel real. When we talked about movie palaces, we talked about the way in which the movie industry wanted to expand that idea of fantasy even into the movie-going experience. And that's by the 1920s, you're getting these exotic-looking movie palaces that seemed luxurious and opulent. They wanted to really tap into that exotic, luxurious nature. Well, what if they could take it one step further? What if they could market the idea that our movies are made in a place that is itself a fantasy land? Southern California, with its sun all the time, its interesting geography, its romantic, exotic history. They wanted to tap into that. They wanted to make that their own. But it had existed long before. This right here is an image of a home in Pasadena. It's a famous place called the Gamble House. You can take tours of this. I highly recommend it. The Gamble House was built by the Southern California architecture firm of Green and Green. They were two brothers named Green. And they're famous for their craftsman architecture that became popular in Southern California at the end of the 20th century, end of the 1800s, beginning of the 20th century. The Gambles, you probably have heard the company Procter and Gamble. All right, the Gambles were a wealthy family from Cincinnati, Ohio. And the great thing about being rich in Cincinnati, Ohio, is you don't have to stay in Cincinnati, Ohio. So Cincinnati gets real cold in wintertime. Ohio gets real cold in wintertime. So what the Gamble family would do is they would winter in Southern California. And this home was built for the Gamble family to come here in wintertime. Because as cold as it gets in Pasadena in wintertime, it's a hell of a lot warmer than it is in Cincinnati. Even before the movies came to Southern California, there was a tradition of the rich and the wealthy coming out to Southern California for the winter time. In fact, they used winter as a verb. They would winter in Southern California. People would also do it in other warm climates, Florida, for example, but Southern California was one of the places, and there were places like Pasadena that was a popular place for the rich. Laguna Beach in Orange County was a really popular place for the rich in other parts of the country to come and spend wintertime in there. But it wasn't just the wealthy that found Southern California as a fantasy land. Here's an image of Venice Beach. Venice Beach was the idea of a man by the name of Abbot Kinney. In fact, there's a big street in Venice Beach named Abbot Kinney, named after this individual. And he had this idea of replicating Venice, Italy, in Southern California. And so throughout Venice, canals were dug to allow that experience of canals like there are in Venice, Italy. Unfortunately, the canals in Venice Beach, California, didn't work much better than the actual canals in Venice, Italy, because the problem with those canals in Venice, Italy, is the water doesn't flow particularly well. And so that's one of the reasons why if you're going to go to Venice, I highly recommend going to Venice in wintertime. Not only is it a lot less crowded, but those canals filled with stagnant water that's not moving very much, it's real smelly in summertime. In wintertime, though, because of the low temperatures, they don't smell unless you really get close up next to them. Same thing happened in Venice Beach, California. So a lot of those canals today have been filled in and are no longer there. But some of them still exist, and you kind of have to look for them. You have to know where to find them. But they're still there. But Venice Beach became a destination for where you could even go on weekend trips or day trips to go to Venice. And here's the boardwalk in Venice back of the day. So Southern California wasn't only a place for the rich and the wealthy, but for other people too. That interesting Spanish heritage, which was there not just with the sound of the place in Southern California, but also the architecture. All right, going back to the original missions, this is the San Diego mission that was built by the Spanish. But then at the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 20th century, there was a whole revival of first Mediterranean and then Spanish revival, neo-colonial. There's lots of different ways people have referred to this. So you have this interesting Spanish-style architecture. This is the train station in Claremont, California. That's where I live. Again, this seemed very different from the East Coast. That New York didn't have places. Philadelphia, Boston didn't have places like this. There was something just so fantastical about Southern California. And this is what the movie industry wanted to tap into. Right? This is what May wants you to understand. It wasn't just good weather. It wasn't just varied geography. It wasn't just cheap land. There were other places you could have found some of these. But what the movie industry really wanted to tap into was this pre-existing idea of Southern California as a fantasy land, a place too good to be true. They wanted to make that their own. They wanted to market that. The fantasy we are showing you on the screen is made in a real life fantasy. Hollywood, California, Southern California. Right? They wanted that. Let's talk one more aspect about this in terms of once the movie industry starts coming and they start to dominate the town and the movie industry becomes the most important one, it also became a magnet for the young, the beautiful, the talented that wanted to relocate here and try their hand at being successful in the movies. And so Southern California becomes not only this fantasy land, but this fantasy land filled with young, beautiful people working in an industry that was unconventional. That reputation of the entertainment industry still being sort of disreputable and shady still exists. The people involved with movies weren't just like bankers. They weren't just like farmers. They were different. Remember, we talked about Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks getting divorced, and most of America seemed to love it. Okay? They wouldn't have loved it if their neighbors had done it. All right? Somebody living in Davenport, Iowa doesn't seem to be too bothered about Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks getting divorced, but if their neighbors across the street got divorced, there would be lots of gossip about how terrible that is. But if it happens in Southern California, it kind of seems okay. There was a kind of hedonism that comes to be associated with Southern California. That's where the young go. Drink, party, take drugs, have sex, spend money lavishly, wildly, where consumerism starts to run amok. We'll talk more about consumerism as we go on in this class. And so the last thing to sort of think about, we started this unit, and this is going to be the last lecture in our unit. We started this unit with this idea in Larry May's book of his interest in this transition from a Victorian America to a modern America. And you could think of Hollywood, of Southern California, and the establishment of Hollywood as the center of the movie industry, as the accumulation of this transformation from a Victorian America to a modern America. Los Angeles is the most post-Victorian city in the United States. It's the most un-Victorian city in the United States. Just listen to the tone that conservative commentators will use when they talk about Los Angeles. It's not the real America, right? They often think of other places, the Midwest, as being the real America. But Los Angeles, where those movies are made, not the real Los Angeles. And that's because to this day, many conservatives would like more of a reassertion of those Victorian values, still cling to those Victorian values. And Southern California is the sort of the epitome of a vision of a post-Victorian America. And what's so interesting about May's discussion of this is we learn that that wasn't an accident. It wasn't just a random occurrence of events that led the movie industry to Southern California. They knew what they were doing. They wanted to make this happen. They had this vision. Right? Think of Disneyland. Think of Disneyland as that. What was the idea of Disneyland? Disneyland, which was created right around the same time that Cal State Fullerton started. The idea of Disneyland was to create a fantasy land where you could walk in a place, where you could touch a place that seemed like fantasy. That's what Walt Disney wanted to create. Where did Walt Disney get his start? Where did Walt Disney make his money to build Disneyland? In the movies. That's where he got his movie. That's where he got his money. Walt Disney was a movie maker. When we talk about stars of Hollywood, you got to put Mickey Mouse real high in that list because he was one of the great stars of Hollywood. And it was from his Mickey Mouse and other money that Walt Disney decided to create Disneyland. And it is no coincidence that Disneyland is in Southern California. It's not in Boston, it's not in New York, and it is not in Philadelphia. It is in Southern California, the home of the movies. All right, everybody, that's the end of our unit on silent movies. Next up, we get to start talking about jazz in the 1930s and 40s. Another unit I love. I can't wait to get to it. I hope you're enjoying this. Talk to you later. Bye.